Teithio dros ei llwybrau a thaim o'i hyd. Tir oedd ein dewinoedd ar gan yn un o'r gwynt yr ori.
Welcome to the Eryri podcast. Today we're talking about the Celtic Rainforest. I'm Anita Daimond, the Engagement Officer for the Celtic Rainforest project in Wales. Many people, when they hear the term rainforest, think about the tropical rainforest found in the equator, such as the Amazon. But we also have rainforest here in Europe, which is called temperate rainforest on account of the mild climate. Our temperate rainforest is a rarer habitat than the tropical rainforest. And it's mainly found on the western side of the British Isles in Wales, Cumbria, southwest England and western Scotland, hence its name Celtic Rainforest. And it's found here due to the wet air brought in by the winds that come across the ocean. If you've ever had the chance to visit a Celtic rainforest, you will know how magical it feels to be surrounded by the beautiful grand oak trees, carpets of dew-covered mosses sparkling in the dappled light against a backdrop of birdsong and the sound of tumbling rocky streams. Through this partnership project, funded through the European Life Fund and with support from the Welsh Government, we're conserving the valuable rainforest habitat we have here in Wales. We're doing this by undertaking management on sites to care for the fragile and rare species, which include those that live on the trees and the rocks. Some of these are species of lichens, mosses and liverworts, and are only found on a few sites in Wales. I'm joined today by three members of staff who have different roles within the project and represent three main project partner organisations. There's Sabine Nouvet, who works for Snowdonia National Park Authority, Helen Upson, who works for RSPB, and Adam Thorogood, who works for the Woodland Trust. We'll start off by meeting Sabine, who manages work to remove the invasive species Rhododendron ponticum. This is one of the biggest threats to our Celtic rainforest, as well as other important habitats. All right, welcome. So I'd like to just start by asking you about the story behind the introduction of Rhododendron ponticum to Wales and why it's so important that we get rid of it.
So the history of rhododendron in Wales and in the UK dates back to the mid or late 1700s, when it was introduced from the Mediterranean and Middle East region, and it was introduced to the UK as a plant on estates and in gardens. Mm-hmm. Also, it was introduced, as well as being a beautiful plant for the gardens, it was also introduced as a cover plant for things like pheasants. Then in the late 1800s, the plant really started to expand beyond the boundary of gardens, and it started to invade our natural habitats. It's what we call it naturalized itself. This is probably because Rhododendron ponticum comes from very harsh mountain climates. When it arrived in the UK, it found that the weather was mild and very welcoming to it. It didn't have the same cold checks that it would high up in other mountains. And also, there's no native invertebrates, no native bugs that actually eat it. And there's not the native pathogens which might keep it in check. So this plant has managed to do really well in the UK, and especially in the very humid, mild parts of the UK, such as in Snowdonia and Western Wales in the Celtic Rainforest zone.
Thank you. That was a really good explanation of the problem that we're facing here and you know how extensive the Rhododendron ponticum is spreading. I wonder whether you can explain a bit about the work that's already been done, perhaps over the last 20 years or so, to try and manage this really quite big problem we have here.
Yeah, well, rhododendron was first tackled in the Festiniog area, and that was in the 1970s. So it goes back 50 years when, in a designated area, a part of the Celtic Rainforest, which is protected by law, around Blaena Festiniog, there was an initiative by volunteers to start clearing the rhododendron because people recognized it as a problem. And then from there, other groups in other parts of Wales, but especially in the national park, in Snowdonia National Park, started to coordinate themselves to clear rhododendron. And the other big group that did this was the National Trust and the National Park Authority, working around Bedd Gellert and in the Nant Gwynant area. And that's been going on since the 1990s, when the National Trust had a really big program of involving volunteers, the army, visitors from America. Thousands of volunteers from the United States came. And from the 1990s until the early 2000s, there was this big concerted effort to clear rhododendron in the Bedd Gellert area. That laid the foundations for what we call a rhododendron partnership, which was formed in 2008. And that was a partnership between the National Park, Snowdonia National Park, Natural Resources Wales, the National Trust, and Gwynedd Council. And between them, between 2008 and about 2017, £800,000 were raised and used to eradicate rhododendron. But they noticed that that wasn't enough. It seemed like wherever rhododendron was cleared, more rhododendron was expanding. So although they cleared between 600 and 1,000 hectares of rhododendron since the 1990s in Snowdonia National Park, pretty much the same amount of area has been colonized by new rhododendron. So there hasn't really been any decrease in cover of rhododendron during this concerted effort period.
Thank you, Sabine, for that really good explanation of the scale of the problem that we're facing with rhododendron ponticum and the amount of funds and time that organisations are having to spend on sorting out this problem. And I think the key point there is it's just such a huge issue and so detrimental to biodiversity, and it's quite key. The fact that it spreads even when we're trying to control it in one area. So I suppose this brings us on to the point of view is, well, do we need to get rid of all of the rhododendron ponticum, or can we keep some? And what should people do if they have some rhododendron on the land?
Right. Well, I think that the point I made about the fact that the rhododendron, although there's been strong concerted efforts to clear rhododendron, we've still seen and recorded expansion of rhododendron. That goes to the root of the problem, and that's that we have to eradicate all rhododendron across Wales, or at least in these very sensitive areas, such as the oak woods, the Atlantic oak woods. We need to clear all of the rhododendron to prevent it from spreading again. One rhododendron bush in good conditions can produce up to 1 million seeds. And one seed can travel up to 1 kilometre away from that bush. It's been recorded that newly colonized areas of rhododendron in Snowdonia National Park sometimes are as far as 1 kilometre away from an established clump of rhododendron. So it's really important to look at it on a very big scale, geographically, but also time-wise, because clearing rhododendron is not an instant. There's no instant solution. It takes several years of work, of revisits. Sometimes over 20 years, we still haven't cleared rhododendron. It continues to come back. So there has to be this concerted effort geographically and over time. I'd also like to add the value of all the habitats which we're losing to rhododendron. There's 3 habitats in Wales which are suffering particularly from rhododendron expansion. Those are woodlands, heathlands, and blanket bogs. So I'll start with the last one first, blanket bogs. They are where the sphagnum mosses grow, and these sphagnum mosses capture carbon from the air and trap it in the ground. In fact, the UK has the most important source of sphagnum of peat, which is trapping carbon in all of Europe. We're trapping more carbon than a forest just through our peat bogs. And so if rhododendron is growing onto a peat bog, it will prevent any more sphagnum moss from growing because it'll shade out the sphagnum moss and it'll dry it out. And that stops any more capability of capturing the carbon. Mm-hmm. So that's one reason that rhododendron growing onto peat bogs is a problem. Then we can look at rhododendron growing onto heathlands. And heathlands are where you find the heather, bilberry, you find hen harriers, skylarks, and all sorts of other birds which people love, and animals that we all love. Mm. And on these heathlands, if the rhododendron encroaches on them, we will lose the heather, we'll lose the bilberry, we'll also lose the general structure, the openness of the site. And therefore we'll lose all the insects and all the birds and all the animals who rely on heathland for pollination, for nectar sources, or for nesting, or for foraging. And finally, we get to the most interesting one when we're talking about the Celtic Rainforest project, and that's rhododendron encroaching in woodland. And when rhododendron takes over in a woodland, what happens is that the woodland from far away looks the same. You could stand in Bev Gellert and look around and see oak trees all around you, lush green oak trees. But when you go underneath the oak trees, you'll find a dark understory. So although the canopy, the top of the woodland, looks normal, underneath becomes densely overcrowded with rhododendron. And this creates very deep shade, which prevents any other plants from growing. So we lose the flowers and the grasses that grow in the woodlands. But like you've already alluded to, Anita, you lose all the little mosses and lichens, which are so unique to our Celtic rainforests. And finally, the last thing that we lose when we have rhododendron creating such dense, dark understories in the woodlands is it prevents any other trees from germinating and growing. This is a concern if we think about the woodland in 100 or 200 years, because we don't know what will still be standing. It's possible that our old oak trees will die and there'll only be rhododendron. And there's never been a study long enough to tell us what happens after that. Mm-hmm. We don't know what happens afterwards. What we do know is that woodland, if you wanted to call it that, of rhododendron would not be as valuable or as appreciated as an oak woodland. And so we have to make sure that we have young oak trees, young birch, young hazel coming through, and we can't have that with the rhododendron.
Thank you. That's a really good explanation of the scale of the problem we have with rhododendron ponticum and the reasons why we're having to tackle this problem through this project. But it shows it's not just an issue for us as part of the Celtic Rainforest project. It's a problem for us all. It's costing so much money and so much time for people to try and manage this, to rescue our biodiversity. It's really important that people can take some responsibility for that. And if you do have some rhododendron on your land, in your garden, maybe you can see about getting rid of it. We do have a sheet of alternative species that are more biodiversity friendly that you can plant in your garden, and that's available on our website. And many of those are just as pretty, if not prettier, for wildlife, and also provide a home for birds and other insects. So you'll be increasing that biodiversity on your land. So thank you to Sabine. We are now going to move on to look at some of the other aspects of our work. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita.
So it's over to our second guest today, which is Helen Upson. and she has responsibility for the grazing. Grazing is one of the methods that we're using as part of the project to manage some of our sites. So welcome, Helen. Would like to just start off by asking you if you could explain to us why we need to graze woodlands and what needs to be in place to enable that to happen.
Yeah, so most habitats evolved alongside some kind of grazing or browsing, and this continued when people began farming livestock and keeping animals. The problem we have now is a lack of balance. So if you think back, decades and decades ago, many woodlands were overgrazed because we were focusing on as many animals as possible. And that meant the plants and the flowers suffered, and young seedlings and saplings couldn't get away. New plants would get tops bitten off, and everything ended up very bare and very barren. And along with that, the mature trees were kind of growing and aging and growing old, but there was nothing coming through to replace them. So you've got a very limited future there. So in order to correct this, the action at the time was to put a big fence around it and protect it and say no animals are allowed in here. And at the time that was the right thing to do. But now we're finding that the kind of stronger plants, the very dominant plants, so things like bracken and bramble, have completely taken over, and they're shading out the little plants and the flowers and the lichens and the mosses and all the more delicate species. So what we're going to do now is go back in quite gently and knock back these dominant plants and give the little guys a bit of a chance. So we're not trying to eliminate bracken, and we're not trying to completely remove all the bramble because they have value in themselves. But what we want is a recovery of the different types of habitat. So for example, as the habitat recovers some diversity, there's spaces suitable for different insects and different birds, things like pied flycatchers that want a nice open woodland so they can see where they're going. So that's the aim. To do this, we need to make sure that the livestock can be moved and handled safely. So a lot of times the traditional structures or the old stone walls that may be there, they're perfectly suitable. But we also have to think about modern requirements like being able to gather the animals for a TB test. We also need to think about how people and animals use the site. So what we don't want is pinch points where cattle and people might crowd together at a gateway. On some sites, we're subdividing into compartments so that we can monitor and control the grazing in specific areas. So that's quite a useful thing to be able to do. And then lastly, of course, we need access to drinking water, which isn't usually a problem in Wales, but sometimes it can be.
That's really good. So you've explained there quite a lot of different factors, and the real fact that it's quite an experimental process in terms of monitoring and just seeing what happens with the woodland, but also in terms of actually bringing the livestock on site and what's required to do that. So I'm aware you've already learned some lessons through the project so far. I wonder if you could share some of the things that you found along the way.
Yeah, I think one of the really important things to remember is that although grazing woodlands has been an old tradition, a lot of this knowledge has been forgotten, and we're having to relearn things like the best time of year to put them on for certain effects and how many animals will thrive in a certain area. And there's ongoing work in different organisations about the value and the benefit of woodland browsing and different plant species in the diet of these animals. So these are all things that we're hoping to learn along the project. Some of the interesting challenges are simple logistics. So if you think about putting up a fence, many of our Celtic rainforests are remnants and they're hanging on in steep valleys and on rocky cliffs. I like to say, if it was easy, someone would have done it already. And often we're surrounded by farmland, so we have to think about our neighbours and how our neighbours live and work when we're deciding what we need to do. Sourcing suitable animals can sometimes be a challenge, so we're usually looking for quite small numbers of hardy native breeds. And like I said, we're normally looking for cattle, but sometimes there's ponies as well. The trouble is having a small number of animals over a wide area is generally not cost effective for the keeper. So we're working with the graziers that we have to do things like loan a GPS tracking collar so that the keeper can go and find their animals and check that they're healthy without having to spend hours walking up and down hills. And another thing we're doing, yeah, the collars are pretty good. They're working really, really well, actually.
Handy.
Another thing we do that's a bit more on the planning side is to work with the keeper and have the woodland integrated into a bigger grazing plan. So it's no good having 100 hectares of summer grazing and then nowhere for the animals in winter. So again, we're working out season on season what works for the animals, what works for the keeper, what works for the habitat, and it's coming together. It's getting there.
Well done, yes. Lots of different factors and considerations. It's not just as easy as we'll just put some animals on here, is it? Quite a lot of things. So you're obviously trying to get desired outcomes there. So how do you know if you're getting the desired outcomes, and how can people find out more about how they can plan their grazing if they want to do grazing in woodlands?
Yeah, good question. What we have is, I hesitate to say vision, but we have a vision, an outline of what we want the habitat to look like. And that will be quite an open, airy canopy. We want lots of humidity. We want lots of light for the lichens and the bryophytes. Certain sites have other features that we want to look after and protect. So we have that as a kind of end point that we want to maintain. As for how we get there, that's a matter of just observation and adaptation. So on a day-to-day basis, week to week, we've got the site wardens, we've got myself, we've got the grazier, the stock keeper, just walking through the site, seeing what's happening. You know, what is the ground looking like? Is anywhere getting muddy? What is the impact on the vegetation? What are the animals grazing at that particular time of year? And that kind of thing. It informs when it might be time to move to the next compartment if we're thinking of a bigger site. And in the course of one grazing season or a few weeks, the impact on things like bracken and bramble can be really significant looking. But then the follow-up question is, how fast does it grow back next year? And this is the kind of thing we're going to learn long term. And again, every site and every year is unique. So we've got to be ready. We can't just copy what we did before. We have to assess as we go along every time for every site. As a longer term means of monitoring, we do fixed point photography. So this is at least twice a year, so ideally spring and autumn. And this will pick up the slower changes that you might not spot week to week. And it will let us compare year to year as well. And eventually it'll make a really good sort of tracked progress of what the site is doing. And on a larger scale again, we've got at the beginning of the project, we had specialists carry out various surveys on things like the bryophytes and breeding birds. And these will be repeated at the end of the project. So that's about a 6-year gap. And that should give us some really good feedback on, hopefully, how brilliant the grazing regime has been.
Yeah.
And then it's also worth pointing out that a lot of our sites are legally protected. So they could be a site of special scientific interest, or they could be in a special area of conservation. And that means there's a consulting process and a consenting process with NRW. So it's really useful to have these discussions with other experts. And it's another safeguard to make sure that we're considering all the different aspects of a site. And finally, to learn more, have a look at our YouTube channel. We've got some grazing webinars up there. We've got some virtual site visits. We are planning some in-person demo days this year, obviously if COVID allows. And on the website as well, hopefully soon will be some case studies that I'm writing up, and they'll be updated over the next few years as well.
That's superb, Helen. There's so much to consider while just planning the grazing, so much more to the eye, to see what's happening in that woodland. And it's great that we're able to share these lessons with other people. So hopefully people will be inspired to find out more, especially those who'd be involved in some of the management. Thank you for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
So finally, I come to speak to Adam Thorogood, who works for the Woodland Trust. And Adam leads on the work restoring ancient woodland in areas where other types of woodland have been planted. we use a term called PAWS, P-A-W-S. So, Adam, I'd just like to start off by asking you, what do we mean by PAWS? It stands for Planted Ancient Woodland Site. But what do we mean by this, and how do we come to be in this situation?
Oh, hi, Anita. Yeah, good question. So, yeah, like you say, Planted Ancient Woodland Site is a woodland which can be proved to be ancient, but the semi-natural canopy cover, so what you would expect to be there in an ancient wood, has been removed at some point in the 20th century, and the site's been planted up with species of tree you wouldn't expect to be there. So these are normally conifers, but they can also be broadleaf species as well, which you wouldn't expect to find in this part of Wales. So how would you know that such a site was ancient? Just by looking at it, it might seem like the woodland next door, which is also a conifer plantation. But we can tell this by looking at old maps, and also by looking at certain ancient woodland features which the site might support.
So these ancient woodland features, what are these? How do you identify them, and how do you rescue them? Okay, so I'm normally looking for 4 different types of features when I'm looking at an ancient woodland, and these are pre-plantation mature trees, so trees that link back to the previous canopy cover of the site, that are large mature trees. Often they're really surrounded and shaded out by the conifers, and these trees are the ones we want to look after, because the shade that they're under is really threatening the crown of the tree, and it's stopping them producing seed. It's maybe killing off some of the branches. It's gradually killing the tree. And some of the sites I look at, these trees are actually dead. So these are things that actually stand out in some of these sites. Once you get into the woodland and have a look around, these pre-plantation mature trees. Also, what we're looking for, another feature, are concentrations of woodland flowers. Now, these are specialist species which you only find in ancient woodlands. That's because of the way they are pollinated, often in the way they produce seeds and the way those seeds are spread. These flowers and plants don't spread into other places. You don't find them in the field next door. They only really exist in the ancient woodland. So these sites, these PAWS sites, are sort of reservoirs of these species, which you don't find anywhere else. And sometimes there might just be a little patch on one part of the site. Often it's in places where there might be a change in the nutrients in the soil, because they might be close to a boggy area or to a stream. So these are what I call ground flora hotspots. That's another feature. But also looking for areas of dead wood or decaying wood. And this isn't dead really, it's actually living, because there's a huge amount of creatures and different types of fungi which make their home in large pieces of dead wood, but dead wood that's made up from the original tree species that were on the site. So broadleaf deadwood. I mean, conifer deadwood is useful as well, but it's not as useful as broadleaf deadwood. That's another feature. And we're also looking at the soils themselves. The soils in ancient woodlands have never been ploughed, have never had fertilizers added to improve them, as is often the case with agricultural land. So these soils are built up slowly over time with layers of leaf litter which breaks down. They've got huge content of microorganisms and often a higher fungal diversity. And they haven't been compacted often by large machinery driving over the top of them. So the soils are really important as well. And a fifth thing, just to add in, is also the fact that often these sites can contain quite a lot of woodland archaeology. So things like charcoal hearths, where they used to make charcoal in the past, or areas where there are saw pits, where you can see that they've created a big ditch where they've sawn timber into planks. And all of these things contribute to the kind of huge value that these sites have, both ecologically and culturally, to the landscape and the people of Wales. Thank you, Adam. That's a really good explanation there. And really, I think you've hit the nail on the head, isn't it, of explaining just how important it is that we conserve these sites with those ancient woodland features, rather than just relying on starting from scratch on a site that doesn't have that embedded ecosystem just lurking under the surface, just waiting for its opportunity to re-emerge. Which brings me on to think about, well, how do you then go from this situation where you've got these inappropriate species, these conifer trees or whatever they are, to try and return to allow that natural fragile habitat to return and blossom again?
Yeah, okay. So the thing we can do is look at what the threats are to the ancient woodland ecology of the site. And often those things are the fact that there's a really dense canopy cover, which isn't allowing any light into the understory, so the lower layers of the woodland where you might find these hotspots of ancient woodland specialist flowers. There's not enough light getting through, and also there's a build-up of conifer needle litter often, but it's also the case with beech litter as well. It takes a long time to break down, so it sort of covers the forest floor. And it stops the ecology you would expect to find. So diverse ferns and mosses. It sort of prevents those from thriving. So the first thing we can do is to gradually open up that canopy and let some light into the forest floor, and also to open up very gradually around these mature trees that have been stressed for so long by being surrounded by these fast-growing conifers. I have to add, though, we can't really be too negative about the decision that was made in the past. There was a decision that was made to plant these sites with conifers when it was seen to be the right thing to do. Now we know a bit more about these sites, and we're looking at trying to kind of save them to remove these threats. So another thing we can do is to open up and cut into the conifer, the dense conifers, and to create sort of lines within those conifers that we've used to extract the timber, and gradually that will open up the understory and let more light in. So I mean, really the first thing to do is let more light into the site.
Thank you, Adam, for that good explanation. Just to say that you recorded a webinar recently, so people could find out more, couldn't they, by going to visit that?
Yeah, so the webinar is available on YouTube, and it's just under an hour long, and it details how we find out about planted ancient woodlands, how we might identify them, and then I go on to talk about how we might offer some kind of first aid to these sites. For some of the first management that's happened to them for a long time, because often they've been neglected. So I'll run through some of the immediate things we can do, some of the approaches we can take to saving these mature pre-plantation trees, some of the things we can do to save these hotspots of ancient woodland specialist flowers. And yeah, then I go on to look at longer term management of these sites and things we can put in place and some objectives we can draw up to really help bring these sites back into management and safeguard the ancient woodland features.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Adam.
Thanks a lot.
So just to reiterate that you can follow up and find out more about the issues that we've covered today in this podcast by going to our YouTube site, and that's linked to from our website, which is celticrainforests.wales. There's an article in the Natur Cymru newsletter, which some people will get in Wales, all about the project. And we will be having some training days later on this year linked to the pause aspect and also the other areas of the project, like the grazing and so forth. So do keep an eye on our website and follow us on Facebook and Twitter to find out more about how you can get involved and how you can enjoy the Celtic rainforests more. Thank you for your time.